Hello and welcome. Today we have a different kind of video, one that a lot of people have been asking for lately. After all, what's the best operating system for running emulators? In today's video, we're testing Windows 11 against Bazzite. For those who don't know, Bazzite is an OS based on the same system used in the Steam Deck. And just for context, I'm a complete noob when it comes to any Linux distro, so I'll be sharing with you what I thought was worth it, what I found too complicated, the good and the bad points of this system, and finally, the performance when running emulators. Starting with what I didn't like, every time I booted into the OS, I had to manually mount all the drives on my PC. And each time, a different ID was generated for every drive. So I had to reconfigure the game locations every time I started the system, whether in Steam or in emulators. This is probably because I was using internal drives formatted in NTFS or, in the case of external drives, all of them were exFAT. In theory, this shouldn't be a big issue, but trust me, it becomes a really annoying problem during daily use. Another thing I hated was using Mango HUD, which works kind of like ReVtuner statistics. You basically have three options: start Mango HUD using a command along with the path of the app you want to launch, or create a shortcut that opens both at once. The big problem is that Mango HUD breaks a lot of apps and prevents them from launching. Luckily, this system has a game manager called Litris. By adding any game to Litris, you can launch Mango HUD with just one click, and without crashes. For a first-timer like me, who had to figure all of this out alone, it took 3 weeks of trial and error. No forum or ChatGPT suggested doing it that way. Lastly, I couldn't run any of my Steam games that were stored on NTFS drives. I'm not exactly sure why. The games would even download updates, and I used the recommended settings, but overall, none of them launched in Steam. The solution came when I read through Litris documentation. Windows games will likely work through Proton, but there's a catch: the games have to be stored on partitions created for that system. And in the middle of those 3 weeks of testing, unfortunately, my 2TB M.2 SSD died, and Cushion isn't willing to refund or replace the device. Now for the good part. There's a built-in store that makes installing apps a lot easier. No need to dig through GitHub pages. Another thing I found easy was support for various peripherals. I had zero issues connecting Wi-Fi adapters, Bluetooth, or even a wired Ethernet adapter. GPU drivers also come pre-installed. On other Linux distros I've tried in the past, getting an Xbox Series controller to work was a huge pain. But with Bazzite, all I had to do was pair my DualShock 4 or Xbox Series controller, and they were already pre-configured and ready to use. No third-party apps were needed to get them working. The OS interface is decent and simple enough even for a beginner coming from Windows. Steam integration is basically complete right out of the box, ready to run your games. Sadly, it doesn't support loading games from NTFS drives, but aside from that, you get pretty much everything you need after a clean install. If you want to buy original games while saving a lot, check out Instant Gaming, the digital store that sells games for various platforms, such as PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo Switch. Get games of all genres with discounts of up to 95%. You'll also find a variety of gift cards and credits for other services. You can pay for your order through your credit card on a website with a 4.7 rating on Trustpilot. You're buying games directly from Instant Gaming, not from other retailers. If you encounter any issues, Instant Gaming offers 24/7 support. And this month, Instant Gaming is offering a special discount on Wuchang, with a price at least $10 cheaper than on Steam, making it the lowest price ever for the game. What are you waiting for to save? Links in the description. So now let's move on to our actual benchmark tests to see which system delivers better performance. But before we get into it, leave a like to help support the video. And if this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe for future updates. Let's start with RPCS3. This was one of the most compatible emulators and showed phenomenal performance on Bazzite. But there are a few inconsistencies with Mango HUD. As you'll see during the tests, it often reports a steady 60 FPS, but at least to my eyes, it feels like there are performance dips that Mango HUD doesn't catch. Due to how hard it is to emulate the PS3 because of its complex architecture, the goal here isn't to show which system gives the highest FPS. Instead, we're looking to see if Bazzite can be as stable as Windows. Even small hardware differences can negatively affect PS3 emulation. And from what I noticed, while the game running on Bazzite does seem to have slight performance variations, Mango HUD doesn't seem to pick them up. You'll notice it most during abrupt camera changes. As far as hardware usage goes, it's basically the same across both operating systems. The RAM and RAM usage are nearly identical, though in this case, you'd expect Bazzite to perform better, since on Windows I've got Spotify, 2 browsers, antivirus, Discord, and a bunch of other stuff running in the background. It's my main system, which I use for work and for all my daily tasks. One thing you shouldn't compare is CPU temperature, since I couldn't load my water cooler preset on Bazzite. Still, I'd call it a draw. The system is very smooth and consistent. The second game we tested on our PCS3 was Gran Turismo 5, and again, we had a solid 60 FPS on both systems. This time, as expected, RAM usage was higher on Windows. Shader compilation was also better on Bazzite in every game I tested, so you can consider that a rule. Without further ado, let's move on to Gran Turismo 6. The last test we did on our PCS3 was with Gran Turismo 6. As you can see, in the latest builds I've been experiencing these random green artifacts during races. I still don't know how to fix that, but performance has definitely improved in recent emulator updates, going from around 30 FPS to over 50. And that boost was noticeable on both operating systems. In terms of performance, we can call this one a tie, since there wasn't any major difference between the two systems. Now moving on to Nintendo Switch emulation, I managed to configure 3 emulators, Eden, Citron, and Ryubing. The version of Ryubing available through Bazzite store is outdated, and Eden and Citron aren't available there at all. But if you want to install them, it's very simple, just download the Flatpak files for the x64 builds. You'll only need a single file that runs the emulator, with no extra steps or dependencies required. Running the Flatpak is just like doing a clean install on Windows. Just copy over your files if you want to migrate your saves and mods from Windows. But I strongly recommend not importing your shader caches for obvious reasons. In these tests, I ran a few games using Ryubing and Eden. Since I was low on storage space, I was only using a 120 GB SSD, I had to skip testing Citron. But just so you know, Eden and Citron should perform pretty much the same. Starting with Ryubing, it really left a bad impression. While this emulator currently delivers the best performance on Windows, especially with newer CPUs like my AM5, the story is different on Bazzite, with performance dropping by as much as 50%, as you'll see. The first game we tested was Bayonetta 3. Unfortunately, Mango HUD doesn't work with Ryubing. If you try to launch the emulator with an FPS counter enabled, it instantly crashes. So here, we'll have to rely on the in-game FPS counter. With the character idle and uncapped FPS, Bazzite delivered 86 FPS compared to 117 FPS on Windows, a 36% performance advantage for Windows. During actual gameplay, both systems held 60 FPS, but due to Ryubing's heavier demands, I strongly recommend using this emulator on Windows instead. We also tested Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom using Ryubing, just to make sure the issue wasn't limited to Bayonetta 3. And once again, performance on Bazzite was far below expectations. In this case, our result was even worse. Although we couldn't get a precise average, performance can be up to 80% lower on Bazzite. Again, there's no way to compare how the other components are performing. Overall, I suggest staying away from Ryubing if you're using Bazzite. As we'll see later, there are better performing options. Let's move on to Eden, and just to clarify, I only chose Eden because I didn't have enough space to install both Eden and Citron. But you can use whichever you prefer, they'll give very similar results. Once again, the first test was Bayonetta 3, and again we tested with the character idle and FPS uncapped. This time, I was genuinely surprised, going from 80 FPS on Windows to 131 FPS on Bazzite, nearly a 64% improvement. The difference in RAM usage was still around 3 GB higher on Windows, and VRM usage was also about 1 GB higher. Interestingly, CPU usage was lower on Bazzite, even though the emulator was delivering higher FPS, which should be the opposite. If Bazzite is delivering better performance, it should theoretically be using more processing power. When the game runs under normal conditions, at 60 FPS, both emulators perform similarly, with just slightly higher RAM and VRM consumption on Windows. But again, we have to consider that there are more background processes running on Windows. Next was Zelda Breath of the Wild. In many cases, I saw a jump from 80 FPS on Windows to 120 FPS on Bazzite, almost a 50% increase. That's right, nearly 50%. And surprisingly, CPU usage was still lower on Bazzite, while GPU usage was higher, as expected, since the system was rendering nearly double the frames. In Tears of the Kingdom, the performance gap was even more dramatic. As you can see, we had around 60 FPS on Windows, compared to over 100 on Bazzite, about a 70% gain. Incredible. What's even more impressive is how much faster shader compilation is on Bazzite. As I mentioned earlier, shader compilation on Bazzite is basically non-existent. To wrap up the list, I also tested Shad PS4. Unfortunately, Mango HUD couldn't be launched with this emulator. There's apparently a way to make it work, but at the time I recorded this, I didn't know how to do it. Still, as you can see, frame rate and stability look solid, and gameplay is very stable. I also tried other games like Drive Club, but it didn't launch on the Linux version of the emulator. As for Bloodborne, most of the time it felt like it was hitting 60 FPS, which is the max I had set for the game, but when rotating the camera, there seemed to be a slight slowdown. Overall, I didn't find the system that hard to use. Unfortunately, it's difficult to find proper guides or clear directions on where to start, especially for users coming from Windows out of curiosity, like I did. One tip I can give you, Lutris, a game manager that comes pre-installed on the system, will be your best friend along the way. Try to add and configure everything through Lutris before trying to make it run directly. Even though it's a Flatpak app designed for Linux, I still highly recommend using Lutris. There are other apps that do a similar job, like Heroic, which was suggested on Discord by Pikachu. Another tip is that you can load your ROMs from NTFS formatted drives, but when it comes to PC games, they won't work properly. So if you want to take full advantage of what Bazzite has to offer, make sure to set aside some disk space with dedicated partitions. Lastly, it's totally possible to carry over your data, saves, and mods. Emulators will be fully compatible. If you like this kind of video and want to see more Linux distro comparisons, like CashOS or Nobara, drop a comment below. I can also run tests on native PC games if you're interested. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.